All right, well, we left off with Sigmund Freud's theory, and we're picking up where we left off, and talking about how to figure out what's in the unconscious. Because we're unaware of it, we can't report on what's in the unconscious. So, one of Sigmund Freud's goals was to figure out ways to get access to that. Of course, he felt like dreams could be symbolic of issues and such that were stored in the unconscious. So that was dream analysis was one method used in the past. Of course, that's not a contemporary or modern day approach, but also some other theorists developed some other techniques, and one of the more popular ones was the Rorschach inkblot test developed by Herman Rorschach, who, by the way, has a strong resemblance to Brad Pitt, I must say. But anyway, so the idea with the Rorschach inkblot test is that if shown ambiguous images and asked to describe what you see, you would project, unconsciously project these issues from your unconscious onto the image. So you would be shown a series of 10 ink blots and asked to describe each one. And the therapist would look for a number of things, not only the object that you felt like you saw, but also what location the picture you were using, whether you were using the like background information or the colored information, whether or not the object you saw implied that there was some kind of any movement involved. So there were a number of criteria that they would use to analyze things, and they felt like they could get an understanding of a person's personality, and in some cases, even whether or not they were had good psychological functioning. So for example, if you gave this to a lot of people who you knew had different conditions, like maybe you gave it to a bunch of people who were had paranoid delusions, for example. What they would probably report in the images were things of a suspicious nature, like hidden microphones, things about creepy, shadowy figures and stuff like that. And so then you could use that kind of information from other people as a baseline to compare somebody else's responses. And the problem with the Rorschach test, though, is that it's a little bit subjective. So a therapist doesn't always have a unbiased perspective, particularly if they know anything about you in your past. That could influence how they interpret your answers. Now, there was a lot of training that went into doing ink blots and interpreting the answers, and some answers were really common. So, for example, the image in the upper right corner, a lot of people would see two people giving each other a high five, or two elephants pushing their noses up against each other. And so if they're really common answers, well, then that wouldn't be an indication of anything unusual. But the problem is that it is pretty subjective, and if you recorded a person's answers and then had two different therapists examine their answers and draw conclusions from that, it would not be unusual for the two therapists to have somewhat different conclusions. And so for that reason, the test is not producing reliable results, consistent results. So if the test isn't reliable, then it's really hard to say that there's any way it could be a valid way to measure anything in the unconscious. So the ink blots are now kind of an outdated approach. There are still some hardcore psychoanalytic theorists out there who use ink blots, probably more than anything is just to get some information about the person and their past. It could lead to interesting discussions with the person and such like that. Another method that worked similarly as a projective test was to show people a picture, a series of pictures. In each picture, the client would have to tell a story about what happened and who the people were in the picture and what's happened, and then and ultimately their story had to have an ending. So you might imagine, for example, if somebody is struggling with a problem with alcoholism in their family, perhaps the story they end up telling for this picture is something about the woman being frustrated because her husband's drunk. And those kinds of things, again, could be kind of insightful to a therapist, but at the same time, they can also be a little subjective as well. So the projective tests do not hold up very well to reliability and validity standards. And what about the psychoanalytic perspective overall? Well, Freud, some of his theoretical ideas seem to be clearly influenced by his own childhood and his own upbringing. A lot of his theoretical ideas were due to his work with people who had psychological problems. So it may be skewed a little bit in that way. But we still respect Freud because it is fairly apparent that we are influenced by things going on in our mind that we're not consciously aware of. We know early childhood is an important developmental phase in our life, as Freud kind of viewed that children needed to be treated with respect and dignity and nurtured, as opposed to kind of the older perspective that children were kind of wild and the parents had to break the will of the wild child. But overall, Freud, a lot of what Freud talked about is still present in modern day psychology, just in a slightly revised form. And so I would add that that many of his therapeutic approaches are no longer used. So dream analysis. He also dabbled quite a bit with hypnotherapy. That also did not seem to be very effective. And hypnosis can be useful today for some things. Some people find it helpful for pain management and some other things. But in terms of recovering repressed memories, it's no good. We know that for sure. So, all right. So today we also view the unconscious oftentimes a little bit differently than Freud, rather than it being kind of a place in mind where a lot of turmoil and trauma and sex and aggression are stored. Nowadays, we talk about the unconscious more in terms of how our brain processes information automatically. So kind of like when we talked about implicit memories and how you can be doing things while you're daydreaming and thinking about something else. We tend to view those as more like unconscious processes in modern day psychology. So another perspective was a humanistic perspective, and a lot of students have a lot of in agreement with Carl Rogers' theory, and he's a humanistic theorist, and the humanistic perspective emphasizes healthy psychological development and personality development, that people are basically good, that we have free will, and we are very conscious in the choices we make and how to behave, so a high level of self-awareness. And all people have the potential for psychological growth. And we all naturally kind of move in that direction. Sometimes, however, we do get kind of off track, and some of the theorists in this perspective address that in different ways. Abraham Maslow has a theory of personality, or a theory of motivation, and in his theory, he feels that we're always most motivated to meet the most basic needs, and and he proposes this hierarchy of needs. So physiological needs for food, water, air to breathe, those would all be considered physiological needs. And when those needs are met, then we focus on our need for safety. And when those needs are met, our relationship needs for love and belongingness with others. And when those needs are met, our need for esteem, achieving things, feeling competent. And the big one for him was right after that. When our esteem needs are met, then we have the potential to reach our full potential, what he called self-actualization, which is when you're using all your skills and abilities to their fullest potential, feeling really fulfilled in life. And then prior to his death, he added the last one, the self-transcendence needs, which would be more like really kind of understanding and seeking to understand the meaning of life and those deep philosophical kinds of things. So at any point in life, if let's say you were working on, let's say you're, as a college student, maybe you're working on an assignment at home. So your need for competence and achievement, and somebody in your house yells out that the house is on fire. So now your safety needs are suddenly in danger of not being met. His point is, at any time a lower need is not being met, our motivation changes. And when you think about that, it's true. And a lot of times, if you're working on your paper, your motivation will quickly change to get to safety. And that's kind of how he viewed this. And Maslow said, though, that the only way to reach your full potential in life and to become self-actualized was to meet each of these basic needs below it first. So it's kind of a level of progression to get there. This was a segment, little excerpt I took from a book called Please Understand Me Too by David Keirsey. And David Keirsey does a lot of work with personality and personality assessment. Yeah, I'm just going to tell you right now, I think it's valuable to read this. It relates well to the next person we're going to talk about, Carl Rogers. So I'm not going to leave it on the screen the whole time, but you can pause it right now if you want to read through that. So Carl Rogers is a humanistic theorist, and he had a brand of therapy called person-centered therapy. And it's based on his perspective that as a humanistic therapist, of course, that people are basically good and naturally will strive to reach their full potential in life. But a big part of that is understanding who we are as a person. So getting in touch with your sense of self. So Carl Rogers said, we're kind of like acorns, and we can grow and flourish naturally into an oak tree, but certain conditions have to be met for that to happen. Just like an acorn won't grow into an oak tree if the soil's not good, if there's no sunlight and if there's no water. Well, he viewed people in the same way. We can all reach our full potential in life, but there are three things we need. We need genuineness from other people. We need people to be real with us. We need unconditional positive regard or acceptance from others, because we're going to make mistakes in life, but we need people in our life who will still accept us despite some of our failings, despite some of our mistakes. And we need empathy from others. We need people to be able to see things from our perspective and understand us, that we're different from them. But that's okay, like you can be different, but still relate to people and understand where people are coming from. So in a similar way to Maslow's theory of motivation, Maslow said that the love and belongingness needs were pretty basic. They're third from the bottom. And Carl Rogers is acknowledging that too. He calls it positive regard. And this is an important part of his theory because he says we all need positive regard from someone in our life. Not everybody, but it's a basic human need to feel love and accepted from others. And the problem is that sometimes we get positive regard from others with strings attached. That means people are nicer to us, people treat us better, people do things for us, sometimes only when we act the way they want us to act. So take, for example, like peer pressure. Maybe there's a kid at a party with some of his friends, and his friends start maybe smoking weed or something. And let's say this kid doesn't really want to. That's not what he's about. And as his friends offer it to him and he turns them down, maybe it becomes apparent after that his friends start treating him differently. They don't talk to him as much. And his point is, even though they smoke weed and he doesn't, he can still accept them as friends. But for whatever reason, they don't seem to want to accept him because he's acting different than they do. So perhaps then he ends up deciding to smoke weed with them to maintain his friendship, and then they all treat him like a big buddy again. And if that happens, then he's getting conditions of worth. He's getting positive regard from them, but only because he's acting the way they want him to act. When that happens, Carl Rogers said it causes a lot of stress and anxiety in people because you're not acting the way you want to act. You feel fake. There's probably some cognitive dissonance there. So you're acting in ways that contradict your values and morals and beliefs. And I'm going to skip forward to the next slide here real quick. Because Carl Rogers said there's two selves. We have two selves, a real self, which is how we see ourselves. Right? You might see yourself in good ways, some good and some bad ways. But there's also an ideal self. And this is the person that we strive to be. It's the person we would like to be. This consists of our goals and ambitions and all kinds of things like that. If your real self and your ideal self are not overlapping much, then he said there's incongruence, which leads to the depression, feelings of disappointment, etc. So consider the last kid we talked about. His real self is now that he smokes weed. And his ideal self is that he doesn't want to do that. So these two things aren't matching up very well. There's not a whole lot of overlap in them or congruence, so he ends up feeling bad about himself, he's disappointed in himself, etc. The more we behave the way we want to, the more overlap we have between our real self and our ideal self, the more congruence we have, and that leads people to be fully functioning. So how do we get that? Well, for one thing is to figure out who you are as a person and then live your life accordingly. Strive to be that person. The other thing would be to get unconditional positive regard from some people in your life. That is, you have some people in your life who understand that you're different from them, that you make mistakes sometimes, that you have some flaws, but they still respect you and accept you despite that. Most of you probably have a parent who gives you unconditional positive regard, a best friend that gives you unconditional positive regard. And you understand what it's like to be around people who just accept you. It's like you can put down all your facades and just be yourself around them, and it's a really refreshing feeling. So Carl Rogers would try to provide these things in therapy to people. He would be very genuine, give them unconditional positive regard, and be empathetic with them. And the point with unconditional positive regard is you don't have to accept somebody's mistakes as good. So if you have a friend, for example, who got a DUI, you don't have to say oh, that's awesome, good job. No, you can say well, that's unfortunate. Yeah, you made that mistake, but we all make mistakes, and I'll still be here as your friend if you need me. That's what being providing unconditional positive regard is like. So when we get unconditional positive regard, then we can just be ourselves. We get more overlap in our with our real self and our ideal self, and we start feeling more like, hey, I'm the person I want to be now. That leads to you being a fully functioning person, similar to what Maslow called self-actualization. You have a positive self-concept, so you have a positive view of yourself. And then your real self, like your self-concept, becomes very positive. So now this kid maybe says, you know what, I'm not going to smoke weed anymore. And if those guys don't want to accept me, then that's okay. But I have some other friends who like me without smoking weed. And by gosh, I feel pretty good about myself when I don't do that. So I feel good about myself now. I'm living according to my standards. And I'm really being the person I want to be.